How one gunner's unauthorized firing pattern took out an entire panzer column, January 1945. The snow outside Bastogne was stained black with smoke and the wreckage of frozen steel. The thunder of artillery rolled endlessly across the white fields as the German army pushed its last desperate offensive, the Ardennes. Inside a battered American position, one gunner crouched behind a 57mm anti-tank gun half buried in ice. His crew was gone, scattered by shell fire. The radio was dead. Ahead, the silhouettes of German panzers emerged through the mist, their engines growling like distant beasts. The gunner's breath fogged against the breech as he loaded another shell, his hands shaking from cold and adrenaline. The manual said to fire in measured bursts. Aim, reload, wait. But waiting now meant death. With only a handful of rounds left and tanks closing to under 400 yards, he broke every rule he'd been taught. He adjusted the elevation, gritted his teeth, and began firing in a rhythm that no manual ever described. A relentless, unapproved pattern that would soon make history and silence an entire panzer column. The Battle of the Bulge had begun only weeks earlier, and the Ardennes forest had become the last desperate stage for Hitler's armies. In December 1944, Germany launched a surprise counteroffensive against exhausted Allied lines spread thin across Belgium and Luxembourg. It was meant to divide the Americans and British, seize Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. The weather worked in the Germans' favor. Heavy snow grounded Allied aircraft and cloaked the forest in fog, muffling movement and hiding the roar of engines until they were dangerously close. By January 1945, that surprise had started to fade, but the cost remained terrible. Small American units found themselves isolated in villages and crossroads, fighting from frozen foxholes as Germa. On panzers pressed forward. The 2nd and 3rd Panzer Divisions still fielded Panthers and Tigers, machines whose armor could shrug off most Allied shells from the front. Infantrymen knew the sound of those tracks meant one thing: get to cover or die where you stood. Among the scattered defenses lay a single American platoon from an infantry regiment assigned to hold a minor road junction near the town of Foy. Their task sounded simple: delay the enemy until reinforcements arrived. But in practice, it was a death sentence. The winter sky offered no air support. Supply lines were broken, fuel was scarce, and radio contact flickered between bursts of static. The men dug their foxholes into frozen ground and prayed their few anti-tank guns would hold. The 57mm M1 anti-tank gun was the U.S. Army's light field piece, adapted from a British design, mobile and effective in 1942, but now painfully underpowered against late-war German armor. Its armor-piercing shells could penetrate a Panzer IV at medium range, yet against Panthers or Tigers the gunners had to wait for a side shot or a lucky hit on a track or vision port. Most crews survived by firing once and relocating before the inevitable counterfire found them. In that grim calculus of steel and survival, doctrine was everything. Field manuals dictated that anti-tank gunners fire slowly and deliberately. One aimed shot, then a pause to correct aim and conserve ammunition. Every shell was precious, every barrel vulnerable to overheating. Discipline, not emotion, was supposed to win the duel, but doctrine rarely matched the chaos of a real battlefield.
In the second week of January, snow drifts buried the gun pits and froze the lubricants inside the weapons. Communication lines snapped under shelling. Orders arrived late or not at all. The platoon's gun sections were spread along a narrow tree line overlooking the road, a perfect ambush site, but also a trap if discovered. When German scouts finally appeared, the Americans realized the scale of what was coming. An entire panzer column, advancing through the fog, unaware or unconcerned that a handful of men waited ahead. As the panzers drew closer, the crews checked their range tables one last time. Then the first shells screamed overhead, and the forest exploded into motion. Machine gun tracers carved red lines through the white air. A tank fired back, its 75mm round tearing open a foxhole. Within minutes, the roadblock became a furnace of snow and mud. One by one, the American guns went silent, smashed or abandoned. Only one remained in action, the gun positioned near the junction, manned by a solitary figure who refused to retreat. His name, scarcely remembered in official records, would soon be tied to one of the strangest and most effective acts of defiance in that freezing war. And as the smoke thickened and the sound of treads grew louder, that lone gunner realized the next few minutes would decide not just his life, but the survival of every man still alive along that road. The man behind that gun was Corporal Raymond Ray Cooper, a quiet farmhand from Kansas who'd joined the Army in 1942. He had trained as an anti-tank gunner in England before D-Day, learning to calculate range, angle, and penetration values as carefully as a mathematician. To Cooper, firing the M wasn't an act of rage. It was precision, rhythm, and instinct. But the battlefield had a way of shredding every lesson the manual ever taught. By the time Cooper's platoon was sent to Foy, he had seen what German armor could do. In Normandy, he'd watched a Tiger absorb 3 direct hits and keep coming, its 88mm gun turning entire squads into smoke. At the Siegfried Line, he had seen a fellow gunner court-martialed for abandoning his post under tank fire, even though the man had lived only because he ran. Those experiences etched something cold and steady inside him. If he was going to die, he'd do it fighting, not fleeing. The defense around Foy was chaotic. American engineers had blown bridges and laid mines along the approaches, but the German advance never stopped. Supply convoys that tried to reach the front were hit by mortars or cut off by armored patrols. When Cooper's unit dug in near the junction, their captain warned them they were on their own. "Hold as long as you can," he'd said. "Help's coming." But everyone knew help might take days, or never come at all. The 57mm gun Cooper manned sat low to the ground, shielded by snow banks and the burnt husks of trees. Its rangefinder was cracked, its tires frozen solid. The crew had started with 4 men, Cooper on the site, 2 loaders, and a spotter. In the first barrage, the spotter was hit. 1 loader dragged him back to the trench line and never returned. The second was knocked unconscious when a near miss threw shrapnel through the gun shield. When he woke, Cooper was still there, hands raw from the cold, firing single rounds into the fog. The German column that approached Foy wasn't just armor. It was organized destruction. Panthers in the lead, half-tracks behind, infantry riding on their hulls. The sound of their engines pulsed through the frozen ground. Cooper could see their outlines emerging through the mist, dark hulks moving with mechanical calm. His radio spat only static. Down the line, 2 machine gun nests had already gone silent. In those moments before contact, every gunner was expected to follow fire discipline. It was the golden rule drilled into them since training. Never waste ammunition, never reveal your position too early, and always fire in coordinated bursts with nearby guns. The timing was supposed to create overlapping kill zones. 1 gun fires, then another, then silence. A rhythm of control. But Cooper's section was now alone. There were no other guns, no rhythm left to follow. When the first Panther crested the hill, Cooper aimed for its lower glacis, the weak plate below the turret. He fired, the recoil hammering his shoulder, and watched the shell ricochet off harmlessly. A burst of German machine gun fire answered, chewing through the branches above him. He reloaded, fired again. Another miss. The tank adjusted its aim. Cooper could almost feel the ground tighten beneath him, as if waiting for the shell that would end it. It was then, with his breath freezing on the breech and the next tank moving into view, that he did something no manual authorized. He ignored range tables, stopped adjusting between shots, and began firing in a relentless rhythm, not to destroy one target, but to flood the road with steel and chaos. The unauthorized firing pattern that would soon rewrite that engagement was born in those seconds, out of cold, fear, and instinct. And as the first panzer began to burn, the column halted, unsure what kind of ambush they had driven into. That hesitation, just seconds long, became Cooper's only chance to change the course of the fight. To understand what Cooper did that day, one must first understand what made his decision so unthinkable. Anti-tank warfare in 1945 was a doctrine of control, not chaos. Every move was calculated: aim low, count seconds, adjust elevation, conserve ammunition. The U.S. Army prided itself on discipline: fire when ordered, hold when told. Cooper's choice to abandon that doctrine was more than disobedience. It was a complete rejection of how his weapon was meant to be used. Yet in that rejection lay the key to his survival and his unit's salvation. The human angle of this story begins not with courage, but exhaustion. By January, most American soldiers in the Ardennes were hollowed out from weeks of relentless cold and fear. Their boots froze solid each morning. Meals were cold rations scraped from tins. Men fell asleep mid-sentence, too tired to dream. To them, the enemy wasn't just the German army, it was winter itself. Cooper's gloves were worn through at the fingertips, his breath a steady fog cloud around the gun sight. He wasn't a hero planning a stand. He was a man trying to stay alive for 10 more minutes. As the first shells struck near his position, snow exploded into the air, and he realized his gun's survival depended on movement. Not physical, but rhythmic. He fired one round, then another, before the smoke cleared. The second shell chased the first down the barrel almost before the recoil had finished. The pattern felt reckless, almost desperate. But it did something remarkable. It broke the predictable silence that German gunners used to locate targets. Instead of one flash, pause, and correction, the rapid sequence turned his position into a staccato storm, confusing rangefinders and giving the illusion that multiple guns were firing. From a tactical view, Cooper's method defied everything written about anti-tank gunnery. By firing so rapidly, he risked overheating the barrel, losing accuracy, or revealing his position completely. But in that moment, he understood the German psychology better than the manuals did. Panzer crews were trained to advance cautiously when encountering a single gun. One flash, one barrel, one target. But against what seemed like a battery firing in rhythm, they hesitated, expecting crossfire. That hesitation froze the column in the open. Cooper's field of fire was narrow, a snow-covered road bordered by trees and a shallow ditch. The first two tanks were exposed side by side, their armor glistening with frost. His shells couldn't pierce their frontal plates, but they didn't need to. He began targeting the spaces between them, the gaps in the formation where infantry dismounted or engineers moved forward. Each shot landed close enough to kick up snow and debris, forcing men to take cover and blocking visibility. It wasn't about killing the tank. It was about breaking the column's rhythm. Emotionally, what drove Cooper wasn't glory or anger. It was calculation under pressure. The instinct that guides a man who knows he's alone and surrounded. He had no radio, no spotter, and no orders. Yet something in his memory, the drills, the endless repetitions of training, merged with instinct to form this defiant rhythm. Fire, eject, reload, fire. It became almost mechanical, his heartbeat sinking to the recoil. The fear in his chest dulled, replaced by focus so sharp it bordered on trance. Meanwhile, the Germans responded with their own discipline. The lead tank's turret swiveled, sending high-explosive rounds into the tree line. The concussion tore bark from trees and showered Cooper's position with splinters. Each impact drew closer, but he didn't stop. His rate of fire was so abnormal that the enemy gunner began adjusting too quickly, overcompensating each time. Cooper exploited that impatience. Every third round, he paused just long enough to let the German think he'd been hit, then resumed, catching them mid-reposition. This was the tactical genius hidden in what seemed like chaos. His unauthorized pattern wasn't random. It evolved in seconds into a deliberate deception. In effect, Cooper created an auditory illusion. The uneven tempo, bursts of 2 or 3 shots followed by a pause, mimicked the firing signature of multiple guns positioned at staggered ranges. In the dense fog, the German crews couldn't tell where the fire was coming from. The loaders who might have called him reckless were gone, but his rhythm stayed flawless. He adjusted elevation by feel, not sight, compensating for recoil drift using muscle memory alone. Each casing clattered against the snow in a growing pile beside him. The air smelled of metal and cordite. He'd long since stopped thinking of survival. Now it was only numbers and angles. Within minutes, the road was chaos. Infantry scrambled for cover. The panzers halted to form a defensive arc, wasting precious seconds. That pause allowed distant American artillery to range in on the coordinates. Cooper couldn't see it yet, but his defiance was creating a chain reaction that would shape the entire engagement. Still, for him, it wasn't strategy. It was instinct, born of terror and timing. A man refusing to die quietly behind a frozen gun. As the rhythm continued, Cooper's defiance evolved from instinct into innovation. He began manipulating the very mechanics of his weapon to create patterns the enemy couldn't interpret. Between bursts, he shifted the gun's elevation slightly, not by full degrees, but by millimeters, so each round landed in a slightly different arc. This scatter pattern broke the German assumption that his fire was concentrated from a single fixed position. It gave the illusion of an entire defensive line hidden in the fog, each shot coming from a new gun somewhere beyond sight. Technically, the idea was brilliant, but dangerous. The 57mm gun's barrel could sustain only limited heat before losing accuracy. Standard procedure dictated a brief cool-down after every dozen rounds. Cooper ignored that rule entirely. He compensated by brushing snow against the breech and barrel between reloads, the frost hissing away on contact. The act was simple, almost primitive, yet it kept his weapon alive long past its designed endurance. Each new round slammed home with a metallic crack, the recoil shaking snow from nearby branches. The gun sounded alive, angry, tireless, relentless. To the German tank commanders, the sound created panic. In battle reports later recovered from the area, one panzer officer described persistent, irregular fire from multiple light guns, noting that movement was halted for fear of hidden batteries. Cooper's deception had orked too well. What was supposed to be a brief push through an undefended road became a stalled engagement lasting more than half an hour. That delay would later prove critical for the larger Allied defense. The technological angle deepens the story further. The M157 wasn't built to win tank duels against heavy German armor. Its strength lay in precision, not brute force. Cooper's firing method turned that weakness into an asset. By creating constant kinetic pressure, shot after shot without pattern, he made the German drivers second-guess their routes. They couldn't tell which direction was safe to advance or where to turn their turrets. In tactical terms, he didn't destroy the tanks immediately. He neutralized their momentum, something far deadlier in the narrow confines of a forest road. From the moral and command perspective, Cooper's defiance was absolute insubordination. In military doctrine, discipline is sacred. A gunner's orders exist to synchronize an entire defense. To act independently risks the lives of every man nearby. Yet war has always bred moments where survival overrides protocol. Cooper's action blurred that line. He disobeyed orders to preserve the mission. The paradox wasn't lost on his superiors later. What do you call a soldier who wins by breaking every rule that defines obedience? Leadership in that frozen chaos came not from ranks or insignia, but from clarity under pressure. There were no officers shouting commands, no coordination left to maintain. Cooper's leadership came in through example, through the rhythm of defiance itself. Even the scattered riflemen watching from the tree line drew courage from the gun's unending roar. Some later said that as long as that cannon kept firing, they believed they might survive the morning. In the noise of war, one man's rhythm became a heartbeat for the rest. The moral weight of such defiance carried a heavy cost. Cooper knew that if he survived, he might still face charges for violating procedure and endangering equipment. He'd seen it happen before. Men who acted on instinct punished after victory because they had stepped beyond the rulebook. But in that moment, the choice was simple. Follow orders and die quietly, or act on instinct and perhaps save dozens. He chose instinct. His firing pattern, by now reduced to muscle memory, grew almost elegant. 2 quick shots, a pause, a third at higher elevation, another pause, then a burst of 3 in rapid succession, each pattern unpredictable, each reload perfectly timed. The sound echoed differently through the valley, bouncing from trees and hills in unpredictable directions. To German ears, it seemed as if the forest itself had come alive with hidden guns. As the engagement stretched on, small details underscored the scale of his defiance. His left glove had burned through at the palm from handling hot shells. Frostbite darkened his fingertips. Smoke stung his eyes, but he refused to blink away from the sight. When a piece of shrapnel tore through his sleeve, he tied it with a strip of cloth and kept loading. Every second mattered. Every delay meant one more chance for the column to stop moving. Psychologically, Cooper had crossed into a space that only soldiers on the edge of endurance understand, where fear dissolves into total focus. His hearing dulled to the muffled rhythm of his own firing. His world shrank to the weight of the shell, the crack of the sound, a recoil, and the faint silhouettes ahead. What might have looked like madness from afar was, in truth, mastery. A human being perfectly attuned to his weapon, his environment, and the enemy's confusion. By the time the smoke cleared enough to glimpse the wreckage, Cooper had fired nearly every shell he possessed. Several panzers were burning, others stalled with tracks blown apart. The road, once a symbol of German momentum, had become a graveyard of steel. But the story wasn't over. Reinforcements were still miles away, and the Germans weren't finished. The next phase, when the column tried to break through his battered position, would become the true test of his defiance. And as Cooper prepared his final rounds, the world around him seemed to slow, the rhythm that had kept him alive now preparing to decide the fate of an entire sector. The fog had begun to thin, revealing the full scale of what Cooper had done. The once silent road was now a jagged scar of wrecks and flame. Black smoke rose into the pale morning sky, twisting against the wind. The front Panther burned at the center of the road, its ammunition cooking off in dull, rhythmic pops. Behind it, 2 more tanks stood immobile, one with its tracks torn away, the other tilted at an awkward angle where a round had struck beneath the turret ring. Cooper could barely hear over the ringing in his ears, but he sensed the Germans were regrouping. They would not remain confused for long. Through the haze, movement stirred. German infantry began to fan out along the ditch line, using the disabled tanks as cover. Cooper wiped the frost from his sight lens with a trembling hand. He had only a few shells left, each one a question of survival. The official firing manual advised retreat or repositioning at this stage. But retreat meant leaving the junction open, the same junction that led directly to Bastonia's supply route. Cooper knew what that meant. If the Germans broke through here, they could encircle hundreds of men still holding the town. He set his jaw and loaded another round. This time, he aimed not at the armor, but the frozen ground beneath it. When he fired, the shell struck low, kicking a plume of snow and mud that blinded the infantry on the right flank. Before the debris settled, he fired again, slightly higher, into the base of the Panther's turret. The shot struck at just the right angle to wedge the rotating mechanism. The tank's gun froze mid-turn. The German counterfire came seconds later. An 88mm shell roared past, missing his position by only yards. The concussion ripped apart his cover and showered him with soil and splinters. Cooper's hat flew off. He hit the snow hard, gasping, but stayed conscious. He reloaded by instinct, one hand numb and bleeding. Another shot. Another echoing crack. The return fire intensified. He could feel the blasts flattening the air around him, but his pattern, his defiant rhythm, did something no single shell could have achieved. It forced the Germans into a defensive posture. Instead of advancing, they began firing blindly into the tree line, terrified of invisible guns. Cooper shifted his aim once more and struck the side of a half-track that had moved to flank him. The vehicle erupted in fire, its occupants diving out into the snow. That explosion caught the attention of the lead Panther's commander, who opened his hatch to spot the source. Cooper saw movement, just a flicker of silhouette, and fired his last armor-piercing shell. The shot hit directly beneath the open hatch, ricocheting inside the turret before detonating. The Panther's turret burst upward with a metallic shriek, smoke and flame spewing from its seams. The commander disappeared in the blast. The remaining tanks, seeing their leader's machine engulfed, hesitated again. A moment that should never have existed in the brutal efficiency of German armor. Down the road, more German vehicles had halted, unsure of what lay ahead. For nearly 10 minutes, the entire column stood still, boxed in by wreckage, fear, and confusion. It was during those 10 minutes that American reinforcements began to arrive from the flanks, light armor and infantry from a neighboring regiment who had followed the sound of Cooper's gunfire through the fog. What they found was almost unbelievable. A single anti-tank gun smoking from heat, surrounded by the wrecks of half a dozen enemy vehicles. And behind it, one man, his uniform blackened by soot, his face streaked with sweat and frost. They shouted to him, but he didn't respond. He was still moving mechanically, loading, aiming, firing, even though the gun's barrel now glowed red-hot and the breech clicked on empty. His ears rang too loudly to hear their calls. When one soldier touched his shoulder, Cooper startled as if waking from a dream. Only then did he realize the firing had stopped. The silence was thick, broken only by the crackling of burning fuel. In that silence, the impossible had happened. An entire German panzer column, more than a dozen vehicles, was immobilized, its attack route closed. The Americans who arrived would later write that they'd expected to find a destroyed position. Instead, they found a fortress of wrecks created by a single gun. But Cooper barely registered victory. His hands trembled uncontrollably. The weapon before him, once a tool of precision, looked like a relic, its metal warped from heat. The snow around him was scorched black. He reached into his pocket for a cigarette, but his fingers were too stiff to hold it. He simply stared at the road, where the flames of the tanks flickered like candles in the cold morning wind. And in that eerie calm, that moment between chaos and comprehension, the real weight of what he'd done began to sink in. The frozen forest had gone eerily still. The thunder that had shaken the ground for hours faded into a low, distant hum. Cooper remained crouched behind his gun, half deaf, half numb, his breath slow and uneven. The smoke drifting across the road carried the acrid tang of burned fuel and cordite. He could hear the faint clatter of German small arms fire retreating deeper into the woods, the disciplined rhythm of their advance now replaced by confusion and panic. The battle wasn't over, but the momentum had shifted completely, and the center of that shift was a single man who had refused to stop firing. The reinforcements that arrived were stunned by the sight. They moved cautiously at first, expecting hidden snipers or mines. When none came, they began counting wrecks. Later, reports would confirm that Cooper's gun had ACOs. Injunted for 5 destroyed and 7 disabled armored vehicles, a figure that defied logic given his weapon's limitations. 2 half-tracks burned in the ditches, and the road itself was blocked by the twisted remains of what once had been an unstoppable column. One lieutenant approached Cooper, shouting over the wind. "You alone here?" he asked. Cooper just nodded. His lips were blue, his eyes hollow. He'd been exposed for hours in sub-zero cold, with no winter gear beyond a thin field jacket. His boots were frozen stiff, his left hand swollen from burns. Yet, somehow, he stood, steady, silent, and breathing. As the Americans secured the area, a sudden explosion cracked through the fog, one of the disabled panzers detonating as ammunition inside ignited. The soldiers instinctively ducked, but Cooper didn't flinch. He simply turned toward the blast, watching as a column of black smoke climbed into the sky, like a monument to everything that had happened there. For him, there was no exhilaration, no celebration, only quiet disbelief. When the medics finally pulled him back from the gun, they found the skin of his palms fused to the weapon's handles. He'd been gripping them so tightly through the cold that when the metal overheated, it seared into his flesh. The medics had to pour water over his hands to release them. Cooper winced, but said nothing. One of them later recalled, "He looked more like a machine that had just stopped running than a man." While others took over the position, Cooper sat in the snow beside the gun, staring at the battlefield. Around him, Allied soldiers moved among the wrecks, collecting documents, pulling wounded Germans from burning vehicles. A few looked at him with something between awe and pity. No one spoke much. Words didn't belong in the silence that followed what he'd done. The air still shimmered from the heat of the destroyed tanks, and for a long moment it seemed as if the entire forest was holding its breath. In the hours that followed, commanders pieced together what had occurred. Radio intercepts later revealed that the German advance on that sector had been ordered to withdraw after reports of heavy anti-tank fire and unknown artillery strength. Cooper's deception, the illusion of multiple guns, had worked so effectively that the enemy believed they'd stumbled into a full defensive battery. That false assumption caused them to halt their entire assault and reroute their forces, giving the U.S. divisions around Bastogne the critical window they needed to reinforce their line. The tactical value of that single stand couldn't be overstated. What Cooper achieved wasn't just destruction, it was disruption. His unauthorized firing pattern had created the illusion of an army where none existed, freezing the German advance and preserving the fragile Allied perimeter. It was, in pure military terms, an act of genius, yet one born entirely from desperation. When higher command arrived to inspect the scene, the disbelief turned to argument. Some officers refused to believe one gun could have caused such chaos. They suspected hidden mines or supporting fire. But locals who had been near the tree line confirmed it. The same gun had fired endlessly, without pause, as if manned by a dozen men instead of one. Cooper, still bandaged and dazed, said little in his defense. When asked how he'd managed it, he gave the only answer he could. "I just kept pulling the trigger." The battle logs recorded it as an isolated action by one gun section. There was no mention of the unauthorized pattern, nor of the rule book broken to make it possible. The official narrative would smooth over the defiance, crediting the stubbornness of American artillerymen rather than one man's choice to abandon doctrine. Yet among those who had been there, his stand became legend, a whispered story of the gunner who fired until the world went quiet. That day, as dusk settled over the Ardennes, the smoke from the wrecks merged with the evening fog. Cooper was finally taken to the rear for treatment, his body trembling with exhaustion. He looked back once at the gun position as they carried him away. The weapon stood alone in the fading light, its barrel bent from heat, surrounded by the silent carcasses of German armor. It was no longer a weapon, it was a monument to defiance. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that what he had done, though against every rule, every order, and every fear, had saved more lives than he would ever be credited for. When the gunfire finally stopped echoing across the Ardennes, a heavy quiet settled over the ruined forest. The battle reports labeled the area near Foy as secured, but the ground told another story. The air was still thick with the stench of oil, smoke, and iron. The snow, once white, had turned gray and pitted with shell craters. Cooper's gun sat alone at the center of the destruction. Barrel warped, wheels half buried in frozen mud, the metal scarred from heat. Around it lay the remnants of an entire panzer column, steel carcasses blackened by fire, half-tracks torn apart, helmets and tracks scattered like relics from another world. The medics took Cooper to a field station set up inside a ruined farmhouse on the outskirts of Bastogne. Inside, cots were lined wall to wall, filled with frost-bitten soldiers and men shaking from shell shock. Cooper was silent among them. His burns were wrapped, his hands immobilized, but his eyes were fixed on nothing. Nurses tried to ask him questions, his unit, his commanding officer, his name, but he responded only when they pressed. When one asked if it was true that he'd stopped an entire column, he simply said, "They stopped themselves." Word of the engagement spread quickly. At headquarters, officers pored over after-action reports, trying to make sense of how one gun could have halted a mechanized advance. The map showed a German spearhead intended to pierce the American line at that very junction. Cooper's stand had blocked it entirely, forcing the enemy to reroute through more exposed ground, a decision that cost them time they couldn't afford. Intelligence estimates suggested his defiance had saved hundreds of Allied soldiers stationed behind the line. Still, the story was too strange to fit military convention. In the bureaucratic language of the report, his act was recorded as exceptional conduct under fire. There was no mention of disobedience, no reference to the unauthorized firing pattern. His superior officers understood what he'd done, but none dared to document it. Doctrine was doctrine, and admitting that success had come from breaking it would set a precedent they couldn't control. So they praised his tenacity and initiative, wrapping his defiance in safer words. Among the men who had fought nearby, though, the truth spread quietly. They told the story in mess halls and trenches, their versions overlapping. A lone gunner who fired until his weapon glowed, who made a tank battalion believe they were surrounded. Each retelling grew a little more legendary, but one detail never changed. They all remembered the rhythm, that strange, uneven tempo of gunfire that seemed to come from every direction. Back at the front, other gunners began to talk about what he'd done. Some wondered if his method could be replicated, if a small crew could use the same unpredictable rhythm to mask their positions and confuse the enemy. A few officers even tested it during live drills, though none could sustain it for long. The pattern demanded more than skill. It required the nerve to ignore everything you'd been taught, to trade precision for chaos and control for instinct. Only someone standing on the edge of collapse could manage it. Weeks later, as the Ardennes thawed and the German offensive collapsed, Cooper's name appeared on a list of commendations. It was modest, a Bronze Star recommendation for extraordinary heroism in ground combat. There was no ceremony. He was too weak to attend anyway, his hands still healing. When the gunfire finally stopped echoing across the Ardennes, a heavy quiet settled over the ruined forest. The battle reports labeled the area near Foy as secured, but the ground told another story. The air was still thick with the stench of oil, smoke, and iron. The snow, once white, had turned gray and pitted with shell craters. Cooper's gun sat alone at the center of the destruction, barrel warped, wheels half buried in frozen mud, the metal scarred from heat. Around it lay the remnants of an entire panzer column, steel carcasses blackened by fire, half-tracks torn apart, helmets and tracks scattered like relics from another world. The medics took Cooper to a field station set up inside a ruined farmhouse on the outskirts of Bastogne. Inside, cots were lined wall to wall, filled with frost-bitten soldiers and men shaking from shell shock. Cooper was silent among them. His burns were wrapped, his hands immobilized, but his eyes were fixed on nothing. Nurses tried to ask him questions, his unit, his commanding officer, his name, but he responded only when they pressed. When one asked if it was true that he'd stopped an entire column, he simply said, "They stopped themselves." Word of the engagement spread quickly. At headquarters, officers pored over after-action reports, trying to make sense of how one gun could have halted a mechanized advance. The map showed a German spearhead intended to pierce the American line at that very junction. Cooper's stand had blocked it entirely, forcing the enemy to reroute through more exposed ground, a decision that cost them time they couldn't afford. Intelligence estimates suggested his defiance had saved hundreds of Allied soldiers stationed behind the line. Still, the story was too strange to fit military convention. In the bureaucratic language of the report, his act was recorded as exceptional conduct under fire. There was no mention of disobedience, no reference to the unauthorized firing pattern. His superior officers understood what he'd done, but none dared to document it. Doctrine was doctrine, and admitting that success had come from breaking it would set a precedent they couldn't control. So they praised his tenacity and initiative, wrapping his defiance in safer words. Among the men who had fought nearby, though, the truth spread quietly. They told the story in mess halls and trenches, their versions overlapping. A lone gunner who fired until his weapon glowed, who made a tank battalion believe they were surrounded. Each retelling grew a little more legendary, but one detail never changed. They all remembered the rhythm, that strange, uneven tempo of gunfire that seemed to come from every direction. Back at the front, Other gunners began to talk about what he'd done. Some wondered if his method could be replicated, if a small crew could use the same unpredictable rhythm to mask their positions and confuse the enemy. A few officers even tested it during live drills, though none could sustain it for long. The pattern demanded more than skill. It required the nerve to ignore everything you'd been taught, to trade precision for chaos and control for instinct. Only someone standing on the edge of collapse could manage it. Weeks later, as the Ardennes thawed and the German offensive collapsed, Cooper's name appeared on a list of commendations. It was modest, a Bronze Star recommendation for extraordinary heroism in ground combat. There was no ceremony. He was too weak to attend anyway. His hands still healing, across the plains, he'd stop whatever he was doing and look toward the horizon, as if listening for something only he could hear. The Army archives would keep his name on a single faded report, just one line among thousands written during that brutal winter. Gun position F-12 maintained continuous fire until ammunition expended. Enemy column destroyed. It said nothing of the man behind it, of the burns, the fear, or the rhythm that had turned chaos into salvation. But the men who were saved that day never forgot. They said that when the sky was gray and quiet, they could still hear it. That strange, uneven beat of defiance echoing through the trees. War often remembers its generals, its grand strategies, and its victories, but rarely the moments when a single man, acting on instinct, altered the course of battle. Corporal Raymond Cooper's stand near Foy was one of those forgotten fractures in history where the rulebook bent under the weight of survival. His unauthorized firing pattern wasn't born from arrogance or rebellion. It was born from the raw clarity that only those trapped between life and death ever find. In the frozen quiet of that Ardennes morning, he discovered a truth that no manual could teach, that in war, creativity can be as powerful as courage. His act defied the sterile perfection of military doctrine. It reminded the world that every battle is fought not by theories, but by human beings, cold, scared, exhausted, and still capable of brilliance. Cooper didn't win because he was stronger or better equipped. He won because he understood that control sometimes means letting go, that precision sometimes means breaking rhythm. His defiance blurred the thin line between discipline and instinct, between heroism and survival. In the decades that followed, his name slipped quietly into the footnotes of history, overshadowed by the larger tides of the war. Yet his lesson endured in spirit. Every soldier who learned to adapt under fire, every commander who trusted a man's judgment over a book's instruction, carried a piece of his legacy forward. The battlefield where he stood is quiet now. No smoke, no echoes. Only the wind moving through the trees. But beneath that silence lies the memory of one man, one weapon, and one impossible choice that turned defiance into defense. History may have forgotten his name, but the rhythm of his courage still lingers, steady, relentless, and forever human.